Hey there, fictional friends, and welcome to a new episode of Fully Booked. I'm Meaghan.
And I'm Shirin.
And it is the second week of our coverage of apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic, good lord. Whew, it's the beginning of the year. Fiction.
Why did we choose this subject in January?
I don't know. It made sense to me at the time.
But I just feel like we're like putting like sad on top of sad.
No, I agree with you. I know. It's kind of stupid, but what are you going to do? It's fine. Yeah. It's cold and miserable, and I guess we were looking for something to feel cold and miserable with. So
join me in my misery.
Well, last week it was just join us in our irritation about the host.
Such a bad movie.
Which we talked about last week. If you guys had like totally forgotten that movie and book honestly existed, go listen to our episode from last week because it was pretty good. It was pretty funny.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, I have to say, pat us on the back, pat, you know. Anyway, but in continuing, I guess, in that sphere and sort of transitioning more into speaking about like the literature aspect of things this week, we're going to be taking a look at a lot of the differences between sort of young adult apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction and like adult, like regular, general apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction, whatever you'd like to call it. Because I think as we were kind of talking about getting this whole year started and talking about the subject itself, we were kind of speaking about that because we realized how different the tone is if you're looking at YA versus non-YA fiction that's set in like an apocalyptic sphere. Yeah. Or type of story, like, sort of post-apocalyptic, dystopian, like all those things that kind of fit together. It's really very different if you take a look at it and really kind of like look at the nuances that exist in both. And I'm sure that there are very good reasons for that. But before we get started with that, it's the beginning of a new year. Let's see how everything is going for everyone. Shirin, what's on your nightstand now?
I'm reading again.
Woo! 2024 starting off on a high note for you.
It is. I read the fine print, which I do not recommend. It was crap.
I think I read the first two books in that series, and the second one was better with the older, really serious brother there, the oldest one. Yeah, it was better. The first one, I was like, okay, whatever, sure.
Yeah, it was okay. I didn't care for it that much, I think, because I personally have dated somebody who's really rich, and I'm just like, oh, God, why are we, like, romanticizing these people? They're these like,
terrible rich people.
And the way he treats her is like, spot on. Like, no. Anyway, but yes, I read that one, and then I'm starting on Fourth Wing, so.
Yeah. So that'll be exciting.
That I can't wait for, because that is way more my jam.
You got both of the books in that series for Christmas.
I did.
So you'll be able to actually hop onto that soon, which is fun.
Exactly.
Yay.
What about you, Meaghan?
What did I just finish reading? Oh, yes. I just finished The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. Oh, yeah. Which is a sort of, I guess, like if you want to call it kind of like modern gothic Mexican set story that's at like sort of post Mexican Revolution. A young woman marries a don, which is like a lord, basically, because her family was quite wealthy, but her father was killed when the insurgents and everything occurred, and she kind of has no choice in the matter, so she marries a rich man, moves into his house. It's really got feels of like Rebecca.
Oh, right. Okay.
Because there was a previous Donna who was like his previous wife who lived there, who died under strange circumstances.
Interesting.
And things. And there's something, they move in and the staff is a little bit odd, and his sister lives there, but she's also very off-putting and very strange. And there's just something wrong with the house, basically.
Interesting.
I find that this one leans a little bit more into like the haunting aspect as opposed to Rebecca, which, kind of takes a little bit of a different turn in the third act, sort of. But I did appreciate, I liked the characters. I liked the atmosphere of it. It didn't grip me as much as I wanted it to. I was really kind of looking for something a little bit scarier and a little bit more, I guess I was expecting there to be like more of a twist to a certain extent in the story, which I didn't really get that much. It was well written, like it was really good, and I would be curious to read. I know she has a second book, which I haven't read yet, but I do have a copy of at home, The Vampires of El Norte, which is about vampires.
Yeah.
So I'm going to probably give that one a shot sometime this year as well. But I did enjoy it, and I enjoyed her style of writing and everything. I think she's an excellent author. I think I was expecting a little bit more from the story, so it was sort of middle of the road for me.
Fair.
Yeah. Okay, so getting out of the Mexican Revolution and into post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic fiction. Okay. I don't know how we should do this. I feel like, should we talk about, I guess, like what we find like the aspects are that are similar?
Yeah.
Because there probably aren't quite as many, and then get into the differences of things to an extent. Okay. So, I mean, granted, obviously, if you're looking, whether you're looking at young adult or not, in terms of like post-apocalyptic fiction, you can get all kinds of different ones in any kind of fiction that you're reading that way, in the sense of like sometimes it's a disease or an infection, and sometimes it's like an invasion, or that's it, like an atomic bomb of some kind, or an invasion by another species or things like that. So I think all of those, you get those in every sphere. It doesn't matter if it's young adult or not. But I feel like most of the time there's that you're normally following one or two characters, generally speaking. It's not usually like that many to start off with. There are exceptions, obviously. Yeah. There are some that follow, 5 or 6 or however many different characters and are told from multiple viewpoints. But I find that most of the time it's like there's something with this type of story where the author is trying to isolate the characters, which does make sense, obviously. And I'm sure that it would feel very isolating in most cases as well. So that's probably what they're trying to do. But I find that once you get into the nitty gritty of what the conflict of the story is, and what all of the characters are trying to accomplish, that's sort of where, and like the tone is really where things start to veer off in a totally different direction.
Yeah, and I think, yes, the tone for sure, but it's also kind of how they do the setting. So sometimes, like to your point, it's very clear what's going on. Sometimes they'll be very much in depth of what the situation is. This is what happened. Here's the history.
It's true, yeah. The exposition of
but sometimes, and I find this is more in the YA stuff, they won't even tell you what's going on.
No,
you just know that it's a mess.
There's almost no setup.
Yeah, and we just dive right into the story, and it's more about the characters and their interactions,
and less about the world that they live in. Kind of. Yeah, that's true. It's true. You really start to veer off into where that's it, like with general sort of post-apocalyptic fiction, much of the time you're given a lot of backstory in terms of like, how did we get here? Like what happened for us to get to this point where all of these terrible things have occurred and humanity is hanging by its last thread kind of thing, versus where it's true, where I guess part of it too, I think, comes into an aspect of sort of naivete for the characters, where I think in a lot of YA stuff, the characters are younger, they're less experienced with just any aspect of the world itself. And so it's easier in cases like that for the author to kind of skirt around sort of things, because it's like we don't get to understand as much about it because the characters themselves don't necessarily understand as much about what's occurred.
Right. But then again, you will get others where the whole point of the story is to find out what happened.
Yes, yeah.
So I read a novel at one point. It's called The Chrysalids, and the whole point was to figure out like what actually happened.
It's true,
in this
and
world.
It's true. The Chrysalids is a really good example because it's also like it's young characters and everything, but it's so rare. I find that you see that where the focus is. It's mostly like stories like that are mostly focused on slightly older characters.
It is, yeah.
What am I thinking of right now? Oh, yeah. Something along the lines of like The Stand by Stephen King is very, very heavily focused on finding a solution to rebuild and understanding what happened in the first place. Like what happened? How did we get here? And then how are these characters dealing with the fallout? But really like rebuilding things as opposed to just finding each other and finding a way to live kind of thing. Like they rebuild an entire sort of society of people throughout the course of that story. So it's a very different thing than if you look at like, what was that one that we talked about like last year? How I Live Now.
Yeah. That was like during.
Yeah.
And
like it's just started
It's just started. And it's true. Whether you're reading like young adult or, just adult, I guess.
Yeah.
A lot of it hinges on where we are in the story of this apocalypse.
Yeah, like, is it just beginning? Did it happen a while ago?
Is it happening during the story?
Yeah.
Or are we in rebuilding phase? Are we in survival phase? Like, what's going on? And that will obviously dictate the, the relationships, the interactions, well, like the world itself.
Yeah. And like something like The Stand. I mean, it's an absolutely massive book. Yeah. And The Stand is one of those that's all encompassing. It's before, during, and after.
Oof.
Yeah, Oof. It's starting, everything's normal. It happens. We go through the process of everyone dealing with it happening and coming together, and then we get to the rebuilding and like fixing things stage of it, because technically like that story is really about like a battle between good and evil forces, and they just take on the form of something like an infection, like a disease that spreads.
Yeah, or then you get others like The Handmaid's Tale, for example, that's written in a very interesting angle where you're in it, so it's like the story is taking place like after, this was more of a slow burn, like end of the world kind of thing, where
and it's very much after this has been, because it's been this way for a while.
Yeah, and so it's focusing on this one character and what's going on in her life, but then in the book, not the TV show, but in the book, there's like a epilogue where it's basically like after the fact, like many, many years in the future, where they're studying this society at university.
Oh, okay. Like things have gone back to a more normal situation, and now we're looking at it and we're being like, whoa, how did that happen?
Yeah, and like then talking about how they got out of it, but they don't really go in detail because it's just the epilogue, So
that would be a really interesting thing to explore in like more detail. Would be that's it, like the rebuilding after that, like here's your dystopian world that you live in now where all of these things are insane
and it was imposed on by humans,
exactly, and then it's toppled basically by the end of the story, and then we get like that's it, more of an exploration, or you could do it like halfway through the story and then more of an exploration where like would maybe give you more detail, but again obviously like having something like a TV show, you can talk about that more as opposed to one novel. But
the TV show is hard to watch for me. Like it's just too drawn out on the bad stuff.
Well, because they draw out the story a lot, which does make sense. I'm gonna tell people something and they're all gonna be like, what the fuck, I've never watched the TV show.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
The first season was good because it's kind of like shock value, like holy shit, like, and it does have that tone of hope a little bit.
Yeah.
But then I got to like season 3 and I'm like, oh God, like
there's so much of it.
Like it's so bad. Like every glimmer of hope gets squashed. And I had to stop watching it because it's just too hard.
It's too much. I have heard really good things. Like I'll probably get to it eventually. I think it was one of those that I wanted the series to be done basically before I watched it, so I could just kind of watch the entire thing in one shot, I guess.
I don't know if it's done yet. Is it finished?
I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. I'm not sure. I think that it fell out of favor a little bit in some of the later seasons, maybe also because a lot of people felt the way that you did, where eventually they were like, I think we should wrap this up.
Yeah, like I cannot, and I think also because it was filmed in Toronto.
Oh yeah,
and it's like very obviously in Toronto.
Well, it's very obviously in Toronto, and it's Canadian author Margaret Atwood's a Canadian author.
She lives in Toronto. Yeah, and so like there's a scene where they're like hanging the bodies from the town hall in Toronto, and so City Hall. So every time I would walk past City Hall when I lived in Toronto, all I could see were these bodies hanging off of it. Awful, just awful.
Yeah, I can imagine for people who, when you recognize places, that's so incredibly strange.
Yeah,
when I remember, what's that zombie movie? We're still in the same vein.
Oh,
Warm Bodies.
Warm Bodies. Yeah,
they filmed that. We're from the Montreal area, and they filmed that in Montreal.
Yeah,
and there are like a good few scenes where you can basically see like the highway signs and stuff like from the different sections where they filmed it, when they filmed it near like the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, and like there's a good few scenes that are like around that area as well, and you see it, and it's very strange to be watching something, I think because like we're so used to things being set in the States.
New York City,
LA, like big place, Chicago, like big places like that we don't, as Canadians, we don't like see something. And yes, a lot of stuff is filmed in Toronto, for instance, in like the Toronto area, especially, they get a lot of that. Vancouver gets a lot of it and things like that. But when you don't spend too much time in one area, you're not going to recognize it that much. And a lot of the time, a lot of these places are changed quite a bit in post-production. But when you get a film that is filmed somewhere and basically shows knows that it is set in that one place, and you yourself recognize that place. It's really uncanny. And I'm sure that a lot of people who are used to that because they live in like New York or something are probably like, whatever.
We do this all the time.
We do this all the time. But for some of us, it's not the exact same thing, because I don't live in New York or London or a lot of these places.
It's true.
So, okay, something that you did bring up that I think is something that's a really good, I guess, aspect of the differences here to talk about is that glimmer of hope that exists mostly in young adult, dystopian, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic fiction.
Yeah.
There's so often like this big golden thread of like hope and a goal that we're working towards that's running through.
If we just reach our goal, then we will be okay.
Where I find that in like the more adult stories like this, it's more just like, how do we survive the day by day?
Yeah, it's more descriptive of like your existence.
Yes.
And sometimes you don't even find out like if there is anything good that happens at the end, right? Like it's not necessary. Whereas like in the YA stuff, there's always that glimmer of hope, and there's always that one character who's carrying most of the hope, and they will inevitably get killed off, and then the characters are forced to kind of decide,
and then they have to be like, okay, well, I'm gonna do it for them now.
Exactly. Like there's always that, like, and it's always like a little bit more encouraging because you're like, okay, like they're gonna make it.
They also, there's so often, and I think that this was popularized like a while, like maybe 10-15 years ago, there does tend to be in the YA stuff, we have to find a way to make it fun. I know that sounds weird, but I'm thinking from the perspective of like Hunger Games, Maze Runner, stuff where there's this like competition aspect that's introduced.
They gamify the apocalypse.
Yeah, because it like they're doing this thing because it's like you need something to keep your reader like really hooked in. And I think that when you're younger, you don't want the nitty gritty, like really depressing. And then this person died, and then that person died, and then that person had a miscarriage, and then this happened.
And
like
ate the baby.
Yeah, that's it. Like all of those aspects of things. I don't think that you want that when you're younger. Like, you want something that's going to be entertaining and interesting and packed full of adventure and action and stuff. And so I think that that's why it's so easy for your Hunger Games universe to exist, and Maze Runner and Divergent and all of those types of things.
And there's always like a love interest, like inevitably.
Oh God, there's so much more of a focus on the romance aspect of things, people coming together in tragedy and finding each other and working through whatever. And I, like, you can kind of compare and contrast. I think of, what is that one called? Is it called, like, Never Let Me Go or something? Is that what it's called? The one where they're at like a school in England, and it's because they were clones created to harvest their organs. I think I remember that.
And I read the book of this. I think it's called Never Let Me Go, and they made a movie out of it with Carey Mulligan and Andrew Garfield.
Oh right, yeah.
And so basically what's happening is that they're at a school, and they all grow up together, these kids, and they don't really, I think they know what's happening, so they're clones of rich people. Mm-hmm. And as the rich people are getting older, they're coming in and they're harvesting them for their organs.
Oh, okay. That's like a YA version of that other one, The Island, there with Ewan McGregor and Scarlett Johansson.
Right. But it's YA, but it's not really YA because you're following them through their lives as they get older.
Ah, okay.
And like they often say like, oh, they can survive one surgery, they can survive maybe two surgeries,
but then after a certain
but they will
point,
never survive. And like as they get older, they get sicker because they're losing their organs basically. And it's like this romance. I think there's like a love triangle going on between three of them.
Okay.
And you're reading this and you just know it's completely hopeless.
Right.
Like there is no hope for them. They find their interactions and their love within each other, but they have no hope and they don't try and escape. And it's not about escaping or getting out of it because they know they can't, because they're owned basically by these people. And it's just horrible.
God,
like it's so depressing, and the movie is equally depressing. And you're like, holy shit, I could have really done with them doing like a great escape at the end.
Having some aspect of something.
Like,
that's it. Like actually being able to accomplish that. Yeah, it's true. You don't really think about it.
No.
Until that's it. You read something like that and you realize like how incredibly sad that is.
If you remove the hope.
If you remove the idea of hope, which is, it's true. I think that's mostly why the YA sphere of these sorts of like post-apocalyptic stories kind of they stick together in terms of being like, we don't worry, like there's like, you know, like a rainbow at the end of all of this. Don't worry, there's a way to fix this. There's a place you can get to. There is something that you can do that will save at least like a portion of the people, like whatever it is. Where where that's it. It's true that it's true. You might be right. Maybe that one's a little bit more in like the adult kind of section of things, or like quarter of things, because it's
hopeless.
It's hopeless. Yeah, that's it. It's just them like living together and staying, like, you know, being there for each other as much as they can through this life that they didn't ask for.
100%. That's what the book is about.
Wow.
And it's horrible.
That's really sad.
It's really sad, and the movie is 10 times sadder. Oh, Keira Knightley's in the movie as well.
Is she?
Yeah. It was like a big movie when it came out, like in England, I think.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Because British movie.
All British people are in it.
All British people are in it. But yeah, so like I think that's a good example of like why you need that hopeful aspect. Like even if you think of like The Giver, which was a YA.
Very middle grade almost. Everybody reads it in high school.
Everybody reads The Giver, yeah. Well, here anyway.
Yeah, and here it was like a 7th grade read for us. Like you started high school and The Giver was one of your English class reads.
Definitely. And that one's all about like the one person who holds all the memories of the past, basically. And it's like their curse is to hold all the memories, basically. And that has a glimmer of hope because the person who becomes the new giver is like, no.
Yeah,
why are we doing this like
doing
this?
That.
Yeah.
They made a movie out of that as well.
They did. I haven't seen it.
Apparently it's not good, is what I understood. And like Meryl Streep and stuff is in it, but apparently it's not a great movie, so.
Oh, well.
Yeah, that was a really big one too. That's true. That was just one of those books.
Yeah.
That everybody has read at some point.
They still have it. Like the amount of dystopian fiction that they set us to read in high school is horrible. 1984. Yeah. What did we have? I had The Chrysalids. I had The Giver. I had.
Yeah. It was basically all dystopian and Shakespeare. That's like the majority of what you read.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And just like really sad stuff.
Yeah.
Most of the time, like what did I read in high school? Flowers for Algernon.
I read
in
that
high
one
school.
too.
Yeah, that's it. Like The Giver. Oh my God, this is going way too far back, and I'm not telling people when I was in high school, but
it wasn't that long.
Yeah, well, it was long enough. Yeah, God, there were like a lot of stories, like The Animal Farm, 1984. Yeah, there were a lot of like Orwell and older. Stuff like that. Oh God, All Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh God.
Yeah.
No, I don't think we had that one.
Lucky you. We did, and then we watched the movie.
Of Mice and Men.
Of Mice and Men, that's true. That was another one.
Yeah.
I did a couple of plays as well in high school. 12 Angry Men, a couple of other things.
That's it. All like this dystopian, but a lot of it, again, with that strong tone of hope. And all I can think is that, like, you know, when you create like an apocalyptic story, but it's YA, and you have that strong tone of hope. It's like, you know, the children are the future. So if the children can accomplish this, like, hey kids, if you all just work together, look what you can do, kind of thing. Like, I think that's the messaging going through, and like, you know, so. And I think you have the power to change the world. You know?
I think we saw that even like in The Host. It was like when the younger ones banded together and were like, no, there's a different way to do things, than other people started to feel the same way.
Right.
And yeah, it's true. I do think that you see that like over and over and over again. Like you see that in the Hunger Games. Yeah. It's like, no, we're not doing this anymore. In Divergent, you see that. Maze Runner, like all of them, it's pushing against the system of generally adults, like older characters, to decide like this generation, we are not doing things the same way that you did.
Yeah. Like The 100 as well was another TV show.
Yeah, The 100, that's true. And that's based on a book as well, isn't it?
I don't know, but it was a long TV show. Like I watched a lot of it. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, it ran for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's all I can think of, because then when you get into that adult sphere of things, like, can there be hope in them? Yes, obviously.
Of course.
Obviously. And yes, oftentimes they do end on like a slightly more positive note most of the time. But the journey to get there is that it's so much less about like, okay, well, we're going to fix things. We're going to change things. And more just like, I'm going to make it through this story by the end of it, guys.
Yeah,
and
I'm just
maybe things will get better, or maybe I will just be alive at the end of the story. And that's your silver lining, is your lead character makes it through, basically. Hopefully,
there are a
with
number of those. Yeah. Where it's like, you know, you read this whole story and at the end it's like, well, I'm alive. And you're like, well, fuck.
And you finish it and you're like, wow.
Great. Do you even want to be alive? Like in this whole setting?
That's
like,
it, exactly. Like, fuck.
You know?
And I you know, it's just, it's just crazy.
Yeah.
That like there's such a different tone, and it's just so funny that authors automatically know, oh, okay, well, adults can handle this shit, but the young people cannot. So we're not going to make it like this, guys. It's going to be much more nihilistic and much darker overall, which is why I do think that, yes, a lot of the apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic stuff does incredibly well in the adult sphere of things, particularly like zombie apocalypse, like style things. You know, your Last of Us, World War Z, like all those kinds of things. Walking Dead. Those all do incredibly well because there is somewhere to go in a society that can be rebuilt.
Yeah.
But it never ends on a point of like a super upswing. It always ends on a point of like, okay, we made it through. Now we're going to see what we can do.
Yeah.
Let's, see what we can manage and see what we can do, basically.
Yeah.
What's another one that's like that? The Girl with All the Gifts is another one that's like that too. Again, ends on like a much, I guess, like a darker kind of tone and stuff. And, there will be a lot, like much darker subject matter, like in something like that, they're trying to find a cure for these kids who are basically like, it's like like a virus, like an infection that exists, and they can kill people and turn them.
Oh, wow.
But it's only affected the children.
Oh, of course.
And they're looking for a solution, but of course, in doing so, they're murdering these kids that do have thoughts and feelings and stuff. So there's like a lot of there's like a much darker aspect to it, and there's like a relationship between like a couple of the adults and one of the kids, this little girl and stuff. And there's like it's. I think when you get to the end of something like that and the little girl makes a decision to do something, like that would be seen as much more negative because it's like a kid character and they've been mistreated. You're more likely to forgive that a little bit than you would be under other circumstances.
True. It is. It's true. You do forgive the child characters a lot more, like in the YA fiction when they do things.
Like in the Hunger Games, they're killing each other, and everybody's like, "Oh, but that's my favorite character." Like this person who's murdered a bunch of people. You're like, "Oh,
like,
are you sure?"
Like, yeah. I mean, and you see that in a lot of different books. You know, like you get a free pass because it's like, oh, it's a kid, so they don't know any better. But like, put yourself in that situation. Like, if, like I think of like. Child soldiers, for example.
Yes,
that must be terrifying.
God, that
because
must be awful.
There's no like level of reasoning.
Not as much. No. There's a little bit less of, I guess, like an emotional or moral compass to an extent, particularly when you are told at a very young age that you can kind of do what you want. Yeah, or your job is to kill people. In the Hunger Games, like they're taught in the earlier or the District 1, 2, 3. They're the ones who are from a young age trained to do this, to be able to win if they are chosen.
It's ingrained in their personalities. Yeah,
and
killers.
That's how it is an interesting example in the Hunger Games because, of course, the further you go down the totem pole with the districts and how poor they are and how little they have access to, the more that it's terrifying to be chosen for the Hunger Games, whereas districts 1, 2, 3, it's a glory. It's proud. They're proud to be doing it because chances are one of them's gonna win. So
only one of them though. The rest of you die.
The rest of you die. So I wouldn't be too thrilled about that. But whatever. It's seen as something that's glory as opposed to just survival and making it through, which is always an interesting kind of aspect of that. But yeah, I think most of the time it's the focus on the characters as opposed to the world, and the overall tone and hope of the story is probably what makes the biggest difference. and how you'll know the most. Am I reading YA or am I reading adult, like apocalyptic fiction? And how do I feel about either of those?
And when you're not too sure which one you're reading, the lines get a little blurred and it gets a little weird.
It can get a little bit weird depending on what it is that you're reading. But what do you guys think of, let's say, do you have like a preference between the two? Like, would you rather something maybe a little bit more realistic and more focused on the character development and the world itself? Or would you prefer something that's a little bit more hopeful and a little bit more about like accomplishing a goal and, a love interest or something thrown in there, just because, sometimes that can add a more positive aspect to a story, obviously. You can let us know about that over on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads at fullybookedca. And you can also check out our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/book was way better. But until next week, guys, keep on reading.
Thanks, everyone.